What is up, folks? Welcome back to another JS drop from this dot. Are you ready to take your Cypress skills to the next level? Well, in this drop, Jordan Powell from Cypress will give you an overview of the framework, cover best practices for end-to-end and component testing, review advanced patterns, and a whole lot more. Let's get started.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share one of my favorite topics, which is Cypress. So hopefully you guys will enjoy today's talk. I'm going to talk, it's going to be pretty slide heavy because most of you all are pretty experienced engineers. Like, I feel like talking, like I'll have some code examples and a lot of slides, but I wanted to preface it. It's going to be a little slide heavy, so I apologize if that's boring, but hopefully the content will be able to it'll teach you what you want to learn. So anyway, so about me, because who's the stranger talking this whole time? I'm Jordan Powell. I'm a developer experience engineer here at Cypress. I spent most of my career in the Angular world / Cypress, doing Cypress type of things, as well as NGRX, for those of you who may not know. But yeah, I have been at Cypress for a year. And if you want to reach out to me, follow me, have conversations, whatever you want to do, reach out to me at Twitter at JordanPow88. And I have a blog at jordanpow88.com if you want to check any of that content out there. So the agenda for today is I'm going to do a quick introduction on overview of Cypress for those of you who don't know what is Cypress, what it does. Going to talk a little bit about why we test, some of the benefits of testing, things like that. And then I'm going to get into some best practices for end-to-end testing with Cypress, as well as some best practices for component testing with Cypress, which for those of you who don't know, component testing is a very new testing type that we just released back in June and for React and Vue, and we released Angular support last month. So I'm going to show some best practices for how to do that. And then going to show some just general advanced patterns that I like to recommend to people. And going to keep this super open-ended. If you guys have questions, I'll have plenty of time at the end to answer them, and we'll go from there. So first of all, I always like to answer the why questions, because I always feel like just talking, there's a bazillion different technologies to pick from, frameworks, new tools, all those types of things. I always feel like if we just spend all of our time following the next flavor of JavaScript or something, we will never get anything done. So I feel like it's always important to ask why. So first of all, what is Cypress, right? The way I like to explain Cypress is that it's basically a tool for reliably testing anything that runs in the browser. And that's an important thing to note, because pretty much any other form of testing doesn't run in the browser. That's the one thing that separates Cypress from most other testing frameworks. Most other testing frameworks that do end-to-end testing, it basically sends commands from outside of the browser to the browser and says, hey, do these series of things, which has, I guess, maybe some benefits, but also has quite a few shortcomings in that approach. But with Cypress, it actually runs in the browser itself. So it's a browser that has an iframe with Cypress in it, as well as your application. And so they work together then in your browser, so you get all the benefits of your developer tools, you get all the benefits of console logs, network requests, just all the tools you're used to using as a developer, building things, you get that with Cypress, which is a benefit, as well as there are many types of situations I've run into when writing tests in the past where using JS DOM or something to sort of mock a browser caused maybe didn't create the exact result wanted. And then, I was talking with someone at NGConf just 2 weeks ago when we were there, and he was saying how they had released this massive bug into production because they were using JS DOM to test a component, and something that a test that passed really it shouldn't have, but because it wasn't run in a browser, you couldn't see it. It was not an accurate way to actually validate that it works the way your users actually use your components or your application. And so that's the one thing I like to really point out, is that Cypress, the benefit, in my opinion, is that it runs in a browser. Another reason why it's really popular, guys, Cypress has over 4 million weekly downloads, which is quite a bit in the testing world. It has more than Playwright, Protractor, and Selenium combined. Again, not that those are not good tools, or that like weekly downloads is the ultimate measuring stick, but I think it just shows like the number of people using it and the popularity around it. So why testing, right? So because I know I've been there before, where it's like, okay, I've written lots of applications, I had 0 testing, and I was not sold on testing. Like, why do we actually do it? And then the more I began to write production code, the more I realized I really needed to add testing. So these are like 4 things I like to explain for testing. So one is documentation. When you write tests, you sort of get this added benefit. It's like not the reason why you write tests, but after you write tests, you end up with this like documentation out of the box about what your application does, how users interact with it, if you're using component testing, what does your component test do? If you're unit testing, what does this function do given the certain input, what's the expected output? So it provides documentation that if you're like me, you forget things, and future self will forget, or maybe someone else on another team, they may pick this up down the road. Maybe you move on from a different client, or whatever your situation. Documentation is always a huge win, in my opinion. Another thing is confidence. I just had yesterday I was wearing a shirt from Shai Resnick, and he gave it to me. And he has a shirt that says, test right, sleep tight. And it's just the idea of like, when you have good test coverage, you sleep good at night, because I don't like getting calls in the middle of the night, saying that your website's down, you need to fix this, something like that. I'm sure none of you have been in that situation, but when you write code and you create a pull request and you merge it, you want to feel confident that you're not breaking something, that you're actually adding value and not like creating a bigger problem. Another thing is safe refactoring. I'm like one of those weirdos that likes refactoring code. And so when you have good test coverage, it's kind of like a license to refactor, because you're like, hey, I have good test coverage. I know how my application is supposed to behave, how this function is supposed to react, or something like that. You get this sort of like blanket security. It's like, hey, I can refactor my code to make it better, make it more efficient, make it faster, whatever the reason why you want to refactor. Testing really, really saves you in those situations. And many times I've worked with a lot of companies that they don't refactor their code because they don't have test coverage, because they're afraid they're going to break something. And then ultimately improved user experience, because in the end, we ship code so that users use our applications, so that they improves their lives. They, you sell something, or whatever the objective is for your website. You make your company money, ultimately keeps you paid. It's the circle of life. It keeps everyone happy, right? You want improved users. Another thing I want to point out is that in testing, this is like the diagram that most of us, if you've been in software for any level, like a decent amount of time, you've probably gone through this type of like software lifecycle, where you had system requirements, and then from there you gather software requirements, then you do some analysis based upon those things, then you design what the program's going to look like, And then you hand that design to some engineer, they're going to write code. And then you're like, let's go to production. We're like, wait, we should probably like test this thing to make sure it's not broken. And oftentimes you catch a lot of things in testing that you probably was oversight in all the other 5 steps previous to that. And so one of the things that one of like our mantras at Cypress is we want to encourage people to shift left. And the idea is like, we want you to think about testing not at the end of this life cycle, but like as close to the beginning as possible. So you begin thinking about testing in the analysis stage, in the software requirement stage. Like when you begin making decisions, you begin to think, okay, how could I actually validate and test that this decision is going to be a good idea or a bad idea, or even validate that it's going to work as expected. Okay, so now let's talk about the types of testing. So here's the traditional testing pyramid. Most of us are familiar with. I'm not the biggest fan of this pyramid, but I want to point it out because it's kind of like, you know, the grandfather, you know, of a family who, you know, they're the patriarch. They've built a family. They have this long history of something that's worked. And over time, you know, you want to learn the good things from grandpa, but maybe life, you know, culture has changed, life has changed, and maybe you want to do things a little bit different than grandpa did, you know, 60 years ago, but you want to take some of the good lessons from him. So in the testing pyramid, the idea is that the majority of your application is going to be comprised of like unit tests. And the idea is like in an enterprise application, you would have maybe thousands of these. They're very quick. They're cheap to run, cheap to write. They're primarily focused on like pure function. So something that given an input has an expected output. Things you write over and over again. And those are things as a developer you're going to write to validate that your code you're writing is working as expected, right? It's kind of like a check for ourselves. And then at the top of that is basically end-to-end, which is I want to test everything. I want to test the way that a user views my website. You know, they hover over the menu, they click on a link, it then navigates to somewhere else. It then fills out a form, then they submit the form, it sends an API request, that gets then persists in some database, it gets a response back. Basically, the critical main parts of your application, end-to-end tests provide the most value, the most bang for your buck, but historically they are very, very painful to write. Thankfully with Cypress, they're not painful anymore, or in almost every case, it's not painful, I should say. So end-to-end tests are very important. And then integration tests are kind of things in the middle. Basically, you have 2 units or 2 things that connect back and forth between each other. And you need to test that when this thing talks to the other thing, that they talk nicely and they're not fighting, and you know, there's no problems between the 2 of them. So this is like the historical testing pyramid. Now this is not like a coin thing, but this is like the way I like to think about it, is that now with Cypress. And so one thing we noticed is that there is this massive adoption for component-driven development. So frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, they've all taken this component-driven approach to writing applications. And so basically all the parts of your application are basically a component or some sort of construct of a component. And so we thought, well, hey, there's kind of like this gap between end-to-end tests and like we have this app with all these components. So we created something called component tests, which are basically allow you to write tests the way you do for end-to-end testing, but instead of testing a route and all the parts of your application and how they play together with each other, it allows you to write a test for individual components in isolation, but test them the way a user would actually interact with them. And we'll get into more of that specifically. But component tests, people are always like, well, like, where does it fall in the pyramid? Because I think about the pyramid, like, where does it go, right? And I like to think of it component tests, because we have so many components in our applications, we end up, the only way we used to be able to test them was we would basically create unit tests for those things. But I always hated doing that. I felt like it was not very valuable. And there were certain things, like if you have, maybe you would test methods in your component, but if you're doing, in my opinion, good architecture in your applications, you don't want a lot of business logic in your components anyway. So you shouldn't be having to write a lot of unit tests for components. So basically we would then not test components altogether, or we would write tests that are maybe not super valuable. So component tests kind of live in between a unit test and an integration test. It technically is like what we call like an integrated test. So in a lot of ways, it eats at some of the shares of unit testing and some of the shares of integration testing. So in most cases in applications, I don't end up writing a lot of integration tests. In some ways, this may completely replace integration tests in most cases, or in some cases, just depending upon your requirements, the needs of your business, your application, and so forth. Okay, so what are the differences between end-to-end to component testing? I mentioned this briefly. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. But here's a chart that explains like some of the main differences. And so like what's tested with end-to-end is that tests everything, the entire app layer, component testing, and individual component. The two things that I think are worth noting here is that who writes them. So for an end-to-end test, typically they're written by developers, maybe like a QA team, someone like that. Like you don't have to have a ton of knowledge with writing code to write like a unit test, or like some experienced senior engineer. I find it's pretty easy to write tests with Cypress. But the difference with component testing, it's not that it's harder to write, but they're typically going to be written by developers and or like a designer. And the reason why is because when you write an end-to-end test, you don't need any context of your application in terms of the framework it uses, the types of components it uses, the technology stack. None of that matters because users don't care about that stuff. They're just visiting your website and clicking buttons and typing things, and they expect it to work the way they expect it to. With component testing, you have to actually have some domain knowledge of the components that you're testing, right? Those are things that end up, so this just something to kind of point out. The other thing is this initialization command. And the main difference is when you initialize an end-to-end test, you do it by site.visit. And the idea is if you want to visit your website, well, the very first thing you have to do is actually visit it. So it goes to your browser and visits the URL that you pass it. With component testing, you don't do that because there isn't a concept of routes. Instead of like visiting a link or a browser, a page, you basically mount the component or the button component, or the individual components that website may or may not contain. Okay, so now that we understand like a little bit about testing and a little bit about Cypress and the different types of testing, I want to focus a little bit more on end-to-end best practices. And the other thing I would mention is the API for writing component tests and end-to-end with Cypress are basically the same. The only difference is that initialization. You're not visiting a component, you're mounting a component, but everything else is the same. So some of these best practices will apply to both, or you may see some overlap, but for the most part, I'll try to highlight some of those, but just so you know, like the API are very similar. So you're going to be doing a lot of the same things in both cases. So this is like the number one thing the number one thing I think you do with Cypress is you select elements from the DOM, right? Because you can't write assertions without having something to assert against, right? So when you're doing end-to-end testing, there's a lot of ways you can select an element. You can get it by its ID, some sort of like, CSS identification, a class. You could get it by its like HTML type, like an input. You can use like ARIA labels or some type of accessibility, which is a good way of doing it. Or what we like to recommend is using a data attribute. And what this does is it allows you to actually put a test specific selector on the elements that you test in your applications that aren't coupled to the styles or the behavior of your application. So let me tell a story. I was consulting with a company one time, and I remember like after a couple of months, I got basically like called into the principal's office. Not really, but it was like a meeting with like this whole other team I didn't even know about existed. And apparently there was like an end-to-end test. And I was like going through and refactoring all this stuff. And like, I was like, unit test pass, we're good, right? And apparently I was like deleting, they were using IDs to test everything. And so, so I was like stripping out unneeded CSS, just things that had nothing to do with like the application code I was writing. I was just removing them because I love removing code. It's like my favorite thing to do. But again, this other team that I didn't even know about, they were writing tests using those exact same things. And for someone who didn't even know that that team exists, there was no clear sort of documentation or way that anyone would know, like, hey, other things are using this, right? So that's another reason. So when you use a data attribute, it's basically saying like, hey, just so everyone knows, this is used for writing tests, right? And so what this kind of looks like is like, so for example, if you get a button on a page, right, there could be 100 buttons on a page. So like getting by a button is too generic and it's not going to be reliable for you. Getting by classes, the same thing, run into the same thing. There may be lots of button classes or button large classes, right? So it's not specific enough, and those are highly subject to change. Getting by IDs, those could work, but again, if you remove that element or don't need that ID for some styling or something, there's no way that really, you're then coupled to the behavior of the actual, the application logic itself. And so you can use something like .contains to basically like limit, sort of narrow down the focus. So it's like, I want to get a button that contains submit. But again, like what happens if they change the name of the text of the button and they say, I want it not be submit, but I want to make it save or something like that. Now you're then coupled to, again, the implementation of the app itself. In some cases, you want to know if that changes. And so those cases, you would maybe want to write a test like that. But the way I like to recommend is using a data attribute. So what you would do is basically, you would get it by, and I like to use the data sci attribute. A lot of people will use like data E-2-E, which is great, but now that we have component testing, it doesn't, you couldn't reuse, it doesn't make sense to use that. So I think data sci basically sort of emphasizes like, hey, this is a Cypress element that I'm adding and don't touch it. So what this would look like is maybe without it, you could write a test that like gets the button and then clicks it, and you would just get it by the class. Well, instead of like doing that, you would just add this data-sci to, and then like a name, and then you could then just get it using the data sci attribute in your selector and clicking on it. And then as long as you don't create, like my button is not a very specific name, so it's probably not the best example. But if you had, as long as those names don't overlap with something else on the page, like you have the best chance of success when selecting elements. Another thing I like to recommend is, and this sort of enforces good behavior, is in Cypress, there is something known as a support file. And what it does is allow you to write custom commands. So basically you can create a command that you said, hey, I'm constantly going to be getting something, or I'm doing something over and over again. So it's like creating like a global function or something that you keep causing, but it's actually prefaced with size. So you do, so in this case, we want to say, I want to use this data dash test as the data attribute that we're going to use everywhere in our test. So I'm going to create a command called get by cell, or short for selector. You can call it whatever you want. And basically it just takes the selector name that I pass it, and it's going to return this element. So then below you just say sci.get by cell and then my button and click it. So you don't have to remember the data attribute like with the square back brackets, and it gets like a little clunky when you're typing it over and over again. But this is an example of how you can use a shared command to kind of reuse some of that behavior. And you can use custom commands for anything you do over and over in your application, and we'll get into some more of that later. So another one of the probably most confusing parts of Cypress is people think it's like a promise, but it's like kind of like a promise, but it's not really a promise, which makes no sense. But the idea is we don't, Cypress essentially has like this command chain. So think of it like, if any of you are familiar with like maybe Redux or like some kind of CQRS or some event system, right? Where it's like when you use Cypress, it basically has this command log, and the reason why it does that is that it can then use those to do so we have like retriability. So with a lot of other frameworks, you have to like wait on elements to appear, or they could be flaky. With Cypress, you don't have to worry about that nearly as much, as because you get retriability. And that's because we use this sort of architectural approach, which is really confusing to understand. But I'm going to just show you what not to do. You don't have to understand how it works, just understand what not to do and you'll be good. But the idea is you don't want to assign like return values. You would want to use closures to access something. So for example, if you're getting an element by an anchor tag, you wouldn't want to assign that to the value of like to a variable like const and then write an assertion later on that, because that's not going to work the way you think it would, like any other JavaScript. What you'd want to do is like get the button and do .then, which again, this is where it's like, wait, that's a promise, right? Well, it's like a promise, right? So again, in some ways, think of it like a promise. In some ways, but don't think of it like a promise, because it'll also confuse you. So, but if you need to, basically, the way it works is it has this subject, right? And so it passes it from one command to the next. And so anytime you need to basically take a deeper dive into what that subject yields or something, you can do .then on it or something. And then, for example, we can say, I want to like kind of pause here. I want to look into this button element that I'm getting. Here you can then say, okay, what's the button text? I then want to submit a form. I then want to, get the button again, and I expect the button text to change, or whatever the logic is. But you would do .then in this, and then you would, outside of this closure, continue the rest of your command. So you probably won't find yourself doing this a lot, but again, just want to point out, like, if you need to do this, like, this is the way you want to do it, and not assigning like a return value. Here's another good one. So an anti-pattern is coupling multiple tests together. So like one test runs, and then you use the state of that test to then trigger the next test. Those are things that I've seen lots and lots of people do with Cypress, and you should try not to do that. Here's an example. So if you have tests that should be able, like, you want them to be able to run independently regardless of order or anything like that. So if you have tests that maybe are related in some way, what I recommend is putting the things that are shared in like a before each hook. So you can say, before every test, you want to visit a certain URL, and maybe you want to get the first name on a form, type your first name, get the last name, type the last name. maybe that's the basis. That's the thing I want to start every test at. And then you can write tests that say, given the same starting point every time, I want to clear the form out, click it, validate that some error appears. But then it's like, you don't want to then go to the next test with that same state there. You want to then, when it hits the next it statement, it's going to run the before each code again. And then you can then safely execute the next test, knowing that it's running, that the state of the previous test does not leak into the first test. The other option is, and this is hard for a lot of people because a lot of us have this arrange, act, assert, like single focus test when it comes like how we write unit tests. But really, you can just combine it into one test, because with Cypress, actually everything you do is an assertion. If you get an element in the DOM, that's an assertion, because if the element is not there, then the test fails. Like every action you take is essentially an assertion, whether you mean it to be or not. So the idea is like, you want to just validate all these scenarios. So you want to just test all the scenarios in a form. There's really a lot of benefit to just doing it in one single test instead of creating multiple small tests, because those are actually going to run slower because you have to reload the page every time. And there's really not value, in my opinion, in separating those tests out unless there's a very specific use case or it's like a pattern your team wants to follow. But in terms of just like high level philosophy, you can create really long tests, and the only downfall is that obviously the more tests you have, it could get through 99. You could create one test for everything in your entire application, and it could go through every single one of them and fail in the last line, and the whole test will fail. That's the only downfall. So there's kind of like a middle ground. Like you don't want to test so granular that it's like not that useful, and you probably don't want to test every single thing in one test. But think about it. I like to think about it from a user journey standpoint. So what are the critical paths a user takes? For example, a form, like this is a user may do all of these exact same things. Like when they do a form, they may try to type it in and then accidentally clear their first name and then submit it and be like, oh crap, I'm getting this error. And then they're like, wait a second, let me clear this out. Let me retype it and submit it and make sure it works. Like that's something a user could like legitimately do. Okay, so another thing that is very foreign for people who may not familiar with Cypress, or I've seen lots of people do this in Cypress, but basically unnecessary waiting. Using sci.wait with like an arbitrary time period is pretty much always a code smell of something else that your test is not doing. It could be rewritten better, or there's some other problem. So the idea is like with Selenium and a lot of other testing frameworks, because you don't have this retriability, you had to basically set arbitrary amounts of time to wait between one command and the next. And the problem with that is that, say you added what would happen is you would write a test, you would set a 2000 millisecond wait time, you would run the test, it would work, you'd push it up to CI, the test would run and it would fail because CI, it took a little bit longer, it took 2001 milliseconds. So then you would go back, you would then change it to 3000 milliseconds, and then you'd rerun it and it would work. And then like next week you would rerun it and it took 3001 milliseconds to run. And so you would then just keep bumping it up. So then you just add this bloated amount of time to run tests. And then if it only took 1 millisecond to run, you're just waiting there for 4 seconds over and over and over again throughout your application. So with Cypress, this is one of the main things that we focused on. So you don't want to do this. But we do have a wait command for if you absolutely need to with an arbitrary number. But what we recommend doing is using an alias. So for example, say you need to wait for a list of users to return from an API call. You can use the intercept command in Cypress to basically, it's like catching any network requests to whatever path you give it. So in this case, it's going to intercept commands, any API requests to API/users. And then you're creating an alias. So you can do .as, and then it basically creates an alias of that request that you can then reference later. So then you can do side.wait and then do @ which is basically the notation that says I'm referencing an alias and then the name of that request. So you see user's request. So in that case, it doesn't wait for an arbitrary amount of time. It just waits for that request to finish. So that way you're only waiting as long as you need to. And then in the bottom case, here you're waiting for like 4,000 milliseconds. Again, you don't need to do that. You don't want to do that. And if you have to do that, you should probably take a step back and think, why should I have to do this in my application? Okay, another thing is setting a global like base URL. So a lot of times people will do something like this, where they'll visit localhost port 8080, indexed HTML or something, and then they run it in CI in a production environment, and it fails because localhost is not the end domain that you're going to run in. It's a different environment. So what you want to do is set an environment, your URL in your configuration, and then you just reference it via like index.html, and that works. Any questions on end-to-end testing before we move on? I just talked nonstop for like 40 minutes straight. Any questions?
Dustin had a good clarification or question in the chat.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. I was just waiting for you to pause. For the side wait, would it be better to say instead, like, don't use side wait if you're trying to defer retry execution? But are there like situations where maybe I have a timer that I'm actually intentionally, like, there's a 30-second timer and I'm actually waiting for that behavior? Like, that's a good side wait behavior.
And yeah, if the requirement of your application is to wait for a set amount of time, then yes, then you want to wait for a set amount of time. But that's the only use case I've seen that seems like a valid use case for waiting, because like that's actually a requirement of your application and not waiting so that you can just test it, right? So that's a good question. Any other end-to-end questions? Let's get to the chat here.
Something I might,
we can come back to them. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just in a general sense, I'd love it if you had maybe some resources around end-to-end testing strategies. Maybe you can share those with me later, but I think generally, I think some people maybe that would be beneficial to, like, how do you
like what to test?
Like, how do you approach a new application? Like, how should you be looking at this? What should you test first? What should your strategy look like? You've covered some of that in this, but I think in a general sense, sometimes people who maybe aren't used to, the full integration Cypress kind of end to end, like there's a slightly different approach that you take.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's something where my team is actually working on, is basically creating like essentially like a generator that generates like, hey, I need to log in, and then it would generate like the recommended logging in test you should write, and then you just actually write the test. So those are things that we're working on. But yeah, I can definitely point you into some more resources around that too.
I really like what you said though, and I think from a demonstrating value to client standpoint, the idea of testing, especially end to end, like actually creates some documentation. That's just an added benefit that I think people get with doing testing, and I think it's a nice thing to kind of keep in the conversation when you're having, those with clients. I like that.
For sure. Cool. I'm gonna jump to component testing, and then we'll have a lot more time to ask more questions. But so I'm assuming, has anyone here like written component testing before? It's like super new. Most people haven't. They're like, I've heard of it, but I haven't done it. It's something that we can do if we have time at the end, but I wanted to just share some like general best practices. So by default, the main one of the differences with component testing compared to end-to-end testing is end-to-end testing relies upon another web server serving a website, and then that's why like you have to serve up your application, and then in another terminal window you have to then launch Cypress, because it needs the website you're going to visit to be like present, like served somewhere, right? But with component testing, it's different. We actually ship a dev server for the given framework specifically. So what I mean by that is we have support for React, Vue, and Angular, and they're like meta frameworks as well. So like Create React App and Next and Nuxt and all that kind of stuff. But the idea is we have dev servers that are configured specifically so it knows how to like compile your components. I did my examples in Angular because it's my first love child. So I'm gonna use this, and I built Angular component testing, so it's the thing I'm most familiar with. But it's the same concept for React or Vue or Svelte or whatever. So the idea is that when you initialize component testing and add it to your site, it will basically configure the dev server for the framework that you're going to test against, and it will also create a mount function, which is the function you're going to be using to essentially mount your component into the DOM to test. And so we give you those mount functions by default. And then the way you reference them is you could, if you wanted to, import mount from, for instance, Cypress Angular or Cypress React or Vue or Svelte or whatever. But by default, it's going to create a custom command in that support file like we talked about. So instead of importing that mount function everywhere, you just do site.mount and then you pass it the component. So this is the default like mount config that you get, for instance, like from Angular out of the box. But one thing you can do with component testing is this is just a custom command. So you can customize it however you want. So you could create your default mount command. You could create a custom mount command or a forms mount command, or like you could create an infinity number of these. But the idea is, for instance, maybe you have in your application, most components, like they have some service that interacts using HTTP client, or maybe you have like a shared module that has shared services, maybe a bunch of shared components, something like that. You can basically add this to your mount command because it's just JavaScript, and you can customize this however you want. So that way, then anytime you run site.mount, it will have whatever you put into this command in it. So you don't have to keep adding HTTP client module and shared module every single time you mount a component everywhere in your application. You would just do site.mount and it will automatically come with that. So in some instances, maybe you wouldn't need those dependencies, but it's not going to like hurt anything to have them, in your application. So that's one of the things I like to recommend is using custom mount configs for your specific instance. Another thing is with component testing, you don't want to, in a lot of ways, you test it like end-to-end testing, because you test the way a user interacts with it. But the difference is you don't want it to depend upon third-party things. You don't want it to depend to make an API request or something like that. So you want to use site.intercept when you're using component testing. And so what you want to do is, for instance, like if you had a login form and you wanted to, validate that when you sign in with a bad password, that you get the error invalid username or password. And so, and instead of like actually typing in, a bad password and making HTTP requests, you wouldn't want to do that. You would want to use site.intercept to basically intercept post requests to the auth endpoint, and then say, I just want to intercept the request and I want to return a 401 because I know that when I return a 401, I'm supposed to get this specific URL or this certain error message in my application. And again, this is where I said that you have to have some level of domain knowledge of the way your components behave and act when writing component tests, because like there's certain things like this, right? Here's an example of, again, a 200, where you're saying, hey, I want to post and I have a 200 code. And so you just set those things, set a body, whatever, because you don't want to actually make those requests. But in this example, in Angular, like if you have an output, right, if you know, maybe a button clicks and it outputs an event emitter to a parent component, something like that, you can use what we call this component properties object. And okay, I'll take a step back. So with component testing, the mount function there's two arguments. One is the component that you want to mount, which is kind of a no-brainer. And then the second is an optionals mount configuration, which in the case of like Angular, it wraps around like testbed. So it's like you could pass it declarations, providers, imports, things like that. React, there's things like you can pass it styles, props, like the things that those frameworks are used to doing. Basically, any configuration that Cypress would need to know in order to mount your component accurately, that's like the second argument in the mount command. So in the case of Angular here, we have a component properties object in the mount command, or yeah, in the mount configuration, that you can basically like pass in an input property, or you can reference any public method on the class or property. But one thing is when you're doing outputs, it can get kind of tedious because you do like on login and then you like, you know, have some event emitter and it's like kind of cumbersome. Well, with Angular, you can use, there's two ways that I like to recommend doing it. Is you can use the create output spy, which is a function that I created in the Cypress Angular. It ships with Cypress Angular, and what it does is it creates the event emitter for you and automatically spies on the emit method. So all you have to do is basically create this function and pass it the alias name that you want to reference later. So then at the end of this test, you can see on line 23, I'm calling site@get, then I'm using the @ sign to say, hey, I want to call an alias, and on login spy is the same name from line 13 that we created, and we say it should have been called. And that's all you have to do, instead of, there's a little bit, it kind of does a little magic behind the scenes, but it's like something that's pretty trivial that you find yourself doing over and over again. The other way I like to do it is you can use this art. There's also this this feature where it can automatically spy on outputs in your class. So because Angular uses TypeScript and all outputs are type event emitters, what it does is the mount function, when this auto spy outputs flag is set to true, it will go through any public property in your component class that has the type event emitter, and it automatically sets up, it basically uses that create output spy function to set up the event emitter and spy on the emit method of it with its name. So for example, if there was an output called on login, then what it does is it uses that same name and then it camel cases spy on the end of it. So if it was button clicked or something, it would be like button click spy. So so in this case, you don't even have to really configure anything other than just pass this argument. So this is something that I also recommend doing in your custom mount config. So when if you wanted this behavior throughout all of your components, you would just add this flag to your mount config, which would be like here. You would just add this here, and then forever, any place there's an output, you wouldn't have to do anything. You just reference it as an alias and you're good to go. And it would feel a little magical. So we didn't turn this on by default because Cypress is pretty magical, but people were like, that may be a little too magical at first. So anyways, you can pass it this flag, and it automatically does the spying, which I find really nice. Anytime I don't have to reuse like trivial things, it saves me time and it's easy. So that's component testing. We can do some more examples and things like this after this, but there's a couple more advanced patterns I wanted to point to, and this won't this maybe get a little bit after what you were asking Ken, but some things that there's two API methods that are advanced that I think that are really powerful that most people don't know about in Cypress. And so one of them is sci.session. And what sci.session does is, you can see on line 2, it basically creates a session for a set of commands. So for example, logging in is something that's probably like, pretty common in most applications. Maybe there's like a route guard that says, hey, you must be logged in order to visit this route, something like that. Well, so in your tests, most people will basically do a before each at the top of the test. It says log in, right? And so what you can do is create a custom command that's like log in. So you just do sci.login at the beginning of every, before every test. And it would basically log in before every test runs. The problem is like that would become pretty cumbersome, right? You would have to like, if you have like type in a form, it logs in, keep coming back, right? But with sci.session, it actually caches the session. So in this case, like you log in, you make a post request to the login endpoint with the username and password that a user like types in, and then it sets that token like in local storage, something that is pretty common, like authentication is just setting that off token. And once you use sci.session, you basically log in one time, like it'll actually, you can see it like logging in, like if you click a login URL and then it like types in the username, types in password, click submit. And then every other time it basically like skips it because it already has that token in local storage. Cypress knows, hey, you don't have to keep logging in over and over and over again because I already know you're logged in. So sci.session is something that can really save you a lot of time, and yeah, it's pretty cool. The other thing is sci.origin, which was a pretty outstanding, not really bug, but a hindrance to the way Cypress works for a long time. And basically is once you visited a URL, what we call is your AUT, which is basically the app under test, it loads that app of your website. So say the very first test, the very first command of your site is typically like visit some URL, like /about, like the about page or something like that. And so what you would do is maybe like you needed to log in or go to some third-party other domain and then come back. Well, anytime you had to switch domain because of cross-origin like security issues, because we're actually in the browser, like Chrome and all the browsers would freak out. Well, with sci.origin, we created this way that you can now do this. So what you do is use a sci.origin command. You then basically say, I want to establish a new domain that I'm going to visit at some point here in the future. And then you can then pass it like arguments, which have to be able to be serialized. So you couldn't like pass it a function or something like that. And then the callback of this, so the third argument is a callback function. And that is basically, once you get to this other place, what do you want me to do? So in the case of like logging in, use the first argument of sci.origin is, the domain you want to visit, which in our case is supersecurelogons.com. Then the second argument is optional, and it is basically arguments that you want to pass to the callback function. And then the callback function takes those arguments and then it executes them in the new domain. So it gets a little tricky, but this is this solves a pretty outstanding problem for a lot of people. So site of origin is something that if you've ran into this, if you've done Cypress for any level of time, logging in and authentication has always been like a huge problem. But this solves majority of them, so that's exciting. So that's all the slides. I know only like 100 of them, but that's basically most of the advanced patterns. I figured that was enough just content to share, but I figured I'd leave like quite a bit of time to answer questions, because I feel like that may be probably more beneficial for you guys. So that's the talk. What questions do you guys have? Looks curious to know the docs currently list session at origin as experimental. Wonder when to be stable. So good question. I'm pretty positive in Cypress 11 it will become a GA feature. So it's not going anywhere. It will be supported. But things that are like some of these features that are really difficult to do, and we're like pretty confident that they're going to work and the API is what is going to be sufficient, but we want to just let everyone know, hey, it could change. So we feel pretty confident at this point. Not sure if it's for sure going to be in 11, but it definitely isn't going anywhere. I'll say that. Let's see. Test application that needs authentication. How do you test an application that needs authentication and reCAPTCHA? Well, that site of origin is a great way to do that. We also have, let's see.
Will the site.origin work? Balash had mentioned that it's fully server-side rendered for the authentication and reCAPTCHA, so there's not like a specific API to get it like a login endpoint or anything. Will that?
Yeah, and so that's the case where it's like if there's another URL that you have to go to actually log in for like single sign-on or something like that, that's where site of origin is beneficial, because before you had to rely upon posting logging in information or something. But for a lot of cases, maybe it's a third party, like, I don't know, like GitHub or like, auth provider where you have to go in, username, password, and then it redirects you back to your application. That's really the use case for site of origin, where it's like you're leaving your application knowing that you want to come back, but because of like the way cores works, it was like, oh, we can't do this. You're trying to, do evil things, right? Let's see. Any other questions? I'm looking through this chat here.
I know Nacho had one earlier too on selectors. He asked like what selectors would be recommended if you're testing for accessibility and using accessibility selectors.
Yeah, so I would say the benefit of using, in my opinion, accessibility for selectors is the fact that it basically forces you to use accessibility, right? Because if you try to write tests for something that doesn't have accessibility, it then forces you to then make it accessible. So I don't think it's necessarily like any specific thing, because you could just do like whatever you create. That doesn't necessarily matter. It's more just like it's something that will, like, it doesn't really affect the logic of your application, and it doesn't affect the styling of it. So it's less likely to break, and it can, like I said, enforce you to do good things, right? Good behavior. So I know that we are also looking into adding some core accessibility features into Cypress that I'm not sure too much the specifics around it, but I think that we'll have like a score and things like that in the future. So hopefully I can give more specific answers to that question in the future, but for now, I would just say it doesn't really matter what you're using. It's just the fact that it's enforcing you to be accessible, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you.
For sure. So anyone else have questions?
So for component testing, which I have not really had much opportunity to mess around with yet, were you interested in this? Is that something that was on the roadmap, or is that something that you brought and kind of were instrumental in helping to get implemented?
So component testing was on the roadmap, but Angular component testing was not. And just because at Cypress, there's like no one with Angular experience. And so I basically was like secretively building it in the background until I was like, hey, I got it to work. And then I was like, hey, we should like add this to Cypress, and then got it happen. So I've learned like open source companies, the best way to get things done is to just like act like an open source contributor and just do the work and open a PR. So it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily the best way you run an organization, but it's something that it's kind of the way I was able to get this done. So
nice. What's the adoption been like so far? I mean, are people digging it?
Oh yeah,
been great.
Yeah, it's been very well received, and I think I'm more tied into the Angular community, so I have more feedback there. But the Angular community was like super stoked about it because like component testing with Angular was so painful, I felt like, and to the point where people just didn't test anything, like didn't test their components. And so I just think there's a lot of benefits to it, and I think people are starting to see it. Especially with standalone components becoming a thing in Angular, doing the component testing, which would be great. So yeah, and it does fully support standalone components, which is great. So would you guys like, would it be helpful if I showed you like component testing? Would that be helpful? We could do something like that.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Anyone else have? I'll create something else, or I'll start this up. But does anyone else have questions in the meantime while I?
Well, I was gonna pitch the question out there. I mean, do the demo instead. I think we're all more interested in that. But with testing library and other great unit component I can't speak, unit and component testing libraries out there for React, Vue, and all of the other frameworks that I'm failing to mention right now. Do you see Cypress component testing to be supplementary to that, a replacement for that, or somewhere in between?
Well, I would say it's probably somewhere in between. In my opinion, the difference with Cypress is that it's actually like running in a browser, and you get like assertions where it's like Storybook runs in a browser, but you don't really get like, you don't really have like, there's no assertions on any of the work, right? You're like, I can see it works, but it's just like different, where it's like Cypress, you kind of get, in my opinion, like the best of both worlds in some ways. So let's just do ng new and create a new application called this dot. Would you like Angular routing? Don't care. We'll do Sass. Can you guys see? Is that too small?
I can see it fine.
I would bump it twice if you don't mind, or basically where you just put it.
Okay, good to know. Of course, Zoom and NPM, this may take a second, but this is my favorite thing to demo because it's my baby. It's the thing I built, so.
I think it's rad that you're spinning up a new app to do this.
Well, I wanted to show like how easy it was to like, get started with it. So, okay. This, I'm going to open code and let's see. So then what we want to do is we want to install Cypress. That's the first thing we want to do. And are any of you familiar with like Cypress since like the new changes in 10?
Some of us have recently had to scaffold new Cypress applications or upgrading existing ones, so pretty
So you've seen
familiar.
this, some of you?
with us.
Yes.
Perfect. So now when you add Cypress, for the first time, it'll just open this, open the screen. In our case, we want to add component testing. It's going to say, hey, it looks like you're using Angular. Also, we could pick any of these frameworks that we wanted to, but it auto picks us up. It's going to say, hey, you have all the dependencies I need, and press continue. It's then going to create, by default, it's going to configure our dev server and our Cypress config for us by default. It's going to generate this Cypress command I was telling you about, where it adds the mount command, and then it's going to basically create this index file, which is the file that will actually end up mounting all of our tests onto. So press continue, and pick our browser, which, by the way, yesterday we released support for WebKit, which is exciting. So you can now test Safari and Safari. And it's like, hey, you don't have any tests. Well, I don't even have any components really. But what I want to do is let's add a test. So let's use whatever. Let's use well, we have a component, don't we? So we have this app component. Here, let me zoom this in just a bit so you can see it better. I'm gonna do app.component.sci.ts, and basically by default in Cypress 10 we changed the spec pattern to use .sci because we want our components not to be in an end-to-end folder, but like live next to the components. So, and what we want to do is import our component that we're going to mount, and then we're going to say app component, and I want to say it can mount it, and then I want to do sci.mount and pass in app component. Press save, and where's Cypress? It now finds our test and it loads our test. So pretty cool. Say we want to, these will like go outside, but say we wanted to, I don't know, we could say sci.get, is this a button? I don't know. What is this thing? Where'd it go? Inspect. It's an anchor tag. Okay, so we could do like sci.get an anchor that contains an Angular. Is this test pass now? So there it goes. So now you can see you're getting all these things. Yeah. So the other thing is, let's create real quick, and feel free to stop me anytime if you guys have questions. I'm going to generate a component called button. Whatever. And we're going to create a test for this. It commands. So you can do this syntax, or you can also use the template syntax. So if you prefer, you can do this. app button. So you can do something like this. The other thing is by default, when you use the other, when you use this syntax, what it does is it, under the cover of mount, you can see here, the second argument of this mount config is all these like Angular things like imports, providers. So you could add all these things to this, but by default, under the cover, it adds the component you're testing to the declarations array. So if you're using the template syntax, you need to manually pass it that button. So you could do something like this, and I want to then go back, click on a button. Now we have a button. It's not really a button, but the thing with component testing is you don't really have to do the like, you don't really need to use like data attributes most likely, because if you're just mounting a button, it's like the only thing on the screen. You don't have a whole bunch of things that you're competing against for selecting. But for example, let's just say button that clicks and it calls a submit method, and we want to say submit. So we have this method, which we want to add this here to submit. And then maybe this read only. You would just basically like add, you know, your Angular things, right? It's like everyone's just watching me type.
The best kind of watching. Everyone's
know,
minting your
exactly.
code. Oh, HTTP.
Too
Almost
many
there.
T's. I did it. So like you could be like, I want to post something, right? You know, API and hello, or something, hi. So you could like post this when you click this button, but this is gonna freak out because it's like, hey, I don't have a provider for HTTP client. You've probably seen this when you wrote like component tests. So what you would do is just in your button component, you would add the HTTP client module here. And now you press save, and now it works, right? But so now if we check network requests and we click this button, it's gonna probably, it's probably not doing anything because I don't write the code right, but you guys get the point. Yeah, you just add your normal providers, declarations. If you had child components, you know, child component, something like that. The other thing is if you're using, the only difference between standalone components is that they're basically considered like a module. So instead of, if this was a standalone component, instead of being in imports, you would just put it here, like button component. That's the only difference, and it would work just exact same way. So, yeah. The other thing is if we wanted this button to, like I mentioned, maybe we want to have an input of like text, whatever, and we had an output, which is pretty common. Clicked, new event emitter, something like this. So instead of like submitting, we want to say click.emit true, something like this. So now if we go to our button and we change this to be what I call it text, I think, super descriptive name. So now there's going to be nothing inside the button because we never gave it a value. So what we have to do is go here And the argument that we use is component properties, and you'll see here is going to give you, let me use this other syntax. Because it's a string, it can't infer the type. So if you do button component like this, we don't need imports or providers for that matter. And then we can just do component properties. And so inside of component properties, hang on, I messed something up. Of course, what I do? I messed that up. Live coding. Okay, so now you're getting the typing from all the public things in the class. So for example, we want to say text, and then we say, hey, is hello, this dot, and it's not equal, it's an object. It's like this. So now it should say this, except for I'm still apparently, oh, I'm still injecting this, which I don't need anymore. So remove this, and now this passes, and it says this, hello, this dot. And then, like I said, real quick, if we wanted to test this output, then we could do one of two things. We could do this output was clicked, and we could say create output spy and say my output spy. And then we could say sci.get the button. And then we could say that dot contains hello, this dot, and we want to click it. And then we want to say, I want to get our alias of my output spy that should have been called. And now it's validating that it called it. So this is kind of how you can do it. And this thing is called clicked. So if we instead did this and we just did auto spy output to true and called this thing clicked spy, same thing should pass, even though we didn't even give it anything. So ta-da.
Nice.
Any other component testing questions or other questions in general? It's like super fast, everything.
I think we had a general question or kind of discussion that we were having a little bit.
Okay.
About end-to-end testing, not component testing. You can read the chat if you want, but the summary is we use a lot of Cucumber and Gherkin in combination with Cypress on a few projects. Maybe I'm going into unfamiliar territory for you. Or you're like,
oh, I'm familiar.
Well, actually, that's the question. What's your opinion on combining all of these?
Don't do it.
Ooh, why? The why is the important.
Spicy take.
It's not okay. I mean, it's if it's valuable to you guys and you like it, then you can use it. But it's not something. I have to remember there are some pretty big limitations to the way that works, and also I feel like Cypress code is pretty easy to read too. So I feel like it's super declarative, and I don't know, I've ran into a lot of issues in the past with using all of those things together. And so I'm not normally a fan of magic. I kind of just like things that work at the base level, but
So that I guess the follow-up question for me would be what limitations jump out to you as like some of the biggest ones? Those would be my biggest areas of concern. Like I'm fairly new to Cucumber and not Cypress. So, for me diving into this, like the pitch is always that you create this layer of abstraction and then people in product or people that aren't technical, are able to read and understand. And your argument seems to be that, and I don't necessarily disagree, that Cypress itself is semantic enough that you shouldn't need that additional layer of abstraction. And so I guess the biggest thing to jump. What? I have a weird high pitched voice. Huh. Oh, that's
Who
I
in
went-
product is reading Gherkin code and like putting it out like methodically is all I have to say.
So I had to say this is not like the hill that I'm willing to die on in general, but I would say that there are plenty of people at Cypress that have strong opinions about it that could give you more concrete examples. But I will say, if I remember correctly, the person who actually wrote either Gherkin or Cucumber or whichever basically said, like, don't do it. Like, it's like, we built this thing, but we don't recommend it. I don't know. I don't have enough context to like give you guys like good advice on this specific issue, unfortunately. But I can wrangle up some resources if it's helpful.
I don't think anybody has a hill they're willing to die on here. I think there's been
I just said it. Put your dukes up.
He definitely does. But I think it's more we do use it, and there's a lot of product owners have very much enjoyed it from the ability of Gherkin tests, and it's a great way to collaborate with QA teams. So
I mean, like I said, if it works for you guys, like, you know, there's no reason, there's no like red flag not to use it. It's just not something that like, number one, the plugin is not it's like a community plugin. So like the Cucumber Cypress plugin is community, and it'll probably always be like that. So as long as those people maintain that plugin, then you guys will be in good shape. But if not, then you're like, you know, it's like anything. Anytime you have a dependency, like, you could be held hostage of it by it too, you know. So, but that's open source. You could also fix it yourself. So, you know, there's trade-offs to all of it. And yeah, don't go changing the work you've done. Like, it's not, again, not a hill I'm willing to die on. But I know plenty of people that is a hill that they would plenty die on. Let's see. Any other questions? Let's see. Is that McDonald's Cucumber?
McGherkin.
McGherkin expert.
For a limited time only, you can come get the McGherkin.
I mean, do they make the cucumber bun, or is there like cucumbers instead of the meat? Like, what is a McGherkin?
Couldn't
Just
be any worse
pickles.
than the meat they already use.
Is a cucumber a pickle? Are we in a pickle?
Ah.
Cucumber is just a pickle that hasn't grown up yet.
Wait, cucumber's a pickle. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
My saltiness comes from, so recently I
From
spent
pickles?
probably 2 hours of my day hunting down this Gherkin phrase in this like 2000 line of like Cypress commands. And it was so close. It matched 3 of them. And it's like, which one is it using? And every time you ran it, it's like, this one, no, this one, no, this one. And like, so many teams had rewritten it that like this Gherkin phrase was everywhere, but it was wired like this. And so like, I have this like really salty past with like finding this phrase that's like, oh, just use this phrase, it's magical. And it's like, yeah, it is. It's magic.
Yeah, unless the phrase is user clicks the button and you have that 100 places in your application. So it's like, yeah, that's a limitation, and that's one of the problems I ran into as well using it. So that's why, again, I always recommend just using Cypress's semantic like things. But if it's valuable for you guys to work with your clients that way, then like I'm not going to tell you to stop doing it. So.
Well, this is so amazing. And Jordan, I just love how ever present you are on Twitter. You know, so for those of you who are watching, like, Jordan is amazing, and he's speaking at conferences soon. So you can definitely catch a bunch of his talks. I know you recently spoke at All Things Open as well, correct? So
yeah, I was at NGConf 2 weeks ago.
Oh my gosh, I missed that one. So sad. But yeah, so I mean, you know, you can follow Jordan on Twitter as well at Jordan Powell 88. Very easy. Did you know 88 is a lucky number for Asians? So
really,
you're a lucky Jordan. Yes.
Wow.
The number 8 is like lucky.
I think 8s are cool in general. Like, it's like infinity, and you know, it's cool.
Yeah.
It's also the year I'm born, so I'm biased. So.
I was say it dawned on me that might be the year you were born, and now I feel extremely old.
Lucky year. I bet you lots of babies were born that year. Time it to have babies born in 88. Okay, cool. Well, is there any like parting words you want to leave us with, Jordan, or any other information or resources you want to point us to?
No, other than we always are wanting to hear feedback from especially people like you guys who work with other agencies and other companies like implementing Cypress, and if there are particular points of friction or like gaps in documentation or tooling or examples that you feel like you guys that we're not providing, just feel free to reach out, because we want to like make your experience as a developer as best as possible. So feel free to reach out, because I want to help you guys. So
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. And again, we always love seeing you, and we'll see you soon.
sounds good.
Thanks, Jordan.
Guys.